Welcome to War Bias, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal conflicts in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today we're going to explore one of the most brutal and lesser-known battles on the Eastern Front during World War II, the Battle of Rzhev. As we embark on this journey, you'll witness the strategic decisions, tactical innovations, and human sacrifices that defined this pivotal moment in modern warfare. In the aftermath of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the Wehrmacht had made significant gains, pushing deep into Soviet territory. The initial assault, which caught the Soviet military off guard, saw the Germans advance over 600 kilometers in a matter of weeks, capturing key cities like Minsk and Smolensk. However, the harsh Russian winter of 1941 to 1942, with temperatures plummeting to as low as 40 degrees Celsius, had stalled their advance, and by the spring of 1942, the Germans were regrouping and reassessing their strategy. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, was determined to reclaim lost territory and push the invaders back. One of the key locations in this struggle was the city of Rzhev, situated about 200 kilometers west of Moscow, which controlled a critical rail junction and stood as a bulwark against further German advances towards the Soviet capital. The city's strategic importance lay not only in its geography, but also in its symbolism. It was a beacon of resistance against the Nazi occupation. As the winter of 1941 to 1942 began to recede, both sides started preparing for their next moves. The Soviet High Command, led by General Georgy Zhukov, one of the most brilliant and resilient military minds of the war, was focused on launching a series of counterattacks aimed at encircling and defeating large segments of the German army. Meanwhile, the German High Command, under Adolf Hitler's direct supervision, was fixated on securing its gains and preparing for a new offensive in the south, aimed at capturing Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. In the spring of 1942, the Soviet forces launched several attacks around Rzhev as part of their broader strategy to relieve pressure on Moscow and create conditions for a major counterattack. These early battles were fierce but inconclusive, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The terrain around Rzhev, characterized by dense forests, swampy valleys, and numerous rivers, proved particularly challenging for military operations, favoring defensive tactics over offensive maneuvers. As the summer of 1942 approached, the strategic importance of Rzhev became increasingly evident to both sides. For the Germans, holding Rzhev meant securing their northern flank as they prepared to launch Operation Blue, the offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. A successful defense would also allow them to maintain pressure on Moscow, keeping the Soviet capital within artillery range. For the Soviets, capturing Rzhev was crucial for threatening the German rear and potentially cutting off their advances in the south. The Battle of Rzhev was not just another clash of arms, it was a collision of strategies, ideologies, and wills played out against the backdrop of some of the most inhospitable terrain in Europe. As we move closer to the first major actions of the Battle of Rzhev, it's essential to understand the complex interplay of strategic decisions, tactical maneuvers, and logistical challenges that both sides faced. The Soviet army, despite its numerical superiority, struggled with coordination between its various fronts and the supply of ammunition and food to its troops. The legacy of Stalin's purges had left deep scars within the military leadership, leading to a lack of trust and cohesion among commanders. Meanwhile, the German army, though better equipped and trained, was overstretched along a vast front, facing not only the Soviets but also the looming specter of war on multiple fronts as the Allies began to make their presence felt in North Africa and Europe. The strain on German resources was evident, with troops often going without adequate food, shelter, or medical care. Morale was beginning to sag, and the once invincible Wehrmacht was starting to show signs of fatigue. The human element, too, cannot be overlooked. Soldiers on both sides were about to face unimaginable hardships, the relentless bombardments, the freezing cold, the hunger, and the ever-present fear of death or capture. The Battle of Rzhev was more than just a military engagement. It was a crucible that would test the endurance, courage, and resolve of every soldier involved, leaving deep scars that would last long after the guns fell silent. For the Soviet soldiers, the battle was not just about defending their homeland, but also about avenging the atrocities committed by the German army. The Nazis had already begun their systematic destruction of Jewish communities, and the news of these horrors had spread like wildfire through the Soviet ranks. The Soviets were fighting not only for their country, but also for their very way of life. As the summer of 1942 wore on, the Soviet forces launched a series of attacks against the German positions around Rzhev, aiming to weaken their defenses and create an opportunity for a breakthrough. One of the most significant of these attacks took place on July 30, 1942, when the Soviet 31st Army, led by General Vasily D. Sokolovsky, launched a massive assault on the German 9th Army's positions near the town of Rzhev. The Soviet troops advanced under the cover of a heavy artillery barrage, which shook the very foundations of the earth and sent shockwaves through the trenches. The cacophony of explosions, screams, and wailing sirens created a maelstrom of chaos, as if the gates of hell had been flung open. As the Soviet soldiers emerged from their jumping-off points, they were met with a wall of fire that seemed almost impenetrable. Machine guns spat out deadly fusillades, cutting down rows of advancing troops like wheat before a scythe. The air was thick with the stench of smoke, sweat, and blood as the Soviet soldiers struggled to make headway against the entrenched German defenders. Despite being outnumbered, the German soldiers held their ground with a ferocity that bordered on fanaticism, fueled by their conviction that they were fighting for the very survival of the Third Reich. The Soviet troops suffered heavy casualties, with some units losing up to 50% of their strength in a matter of hours. The screams of the wounded and the dying filled the air as the Soviet medical team struggled to cope with the sheer scale of the carnage. As one Soviet soldier recalled, "We were like sheep being led to the slaughter, advancing into a wall of fire that seemed impossible to breach. I saw my comrades fall around me, their bodies torn apart by bullets and shrapnel. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn asunder." The failure of this attack was a significant setback for the Soviet forces, and it would take them several weeks to regroup and launch another major assault. The German army, on the other hand, continued to fortify its positions around Rzhev, building complex networks of trenches, bunkers, and barbed wire entanglements. They were determined to hold their ground at all costs, driven by a mixture of ideological zealotry and primal fear. As the days turned into weeks, the Soviet forces began to suffer from severe logistical problems. The roads leading to the front lines were often impassable, transformed into quagmires of mud and ice that seemed to swallow trucks and tanks whole. The Soviet supply trucks were frequently ambushed by German aircraft or destroyed by artillery fire, leaving the troops at the front line without adequate ammunition, food, or medical supplies. The Soviet soldiers were forced to endure unimaginable hardships, fighting in freezing temperatures without adequate clothing or shelter. The Russian winter, with its icy grip and merciless fury, seemed determined to destroy both armies. The temperature plummeted to 20 degrees Celsius as snowstorms and blizzards reduced visibility to near zero. The Soviet soldiers huddled together for warmth, their bodies numb and their spirits crushed by the relentless onslaught of the enemy and the elements. As one Soviet general noted, "The enemy is not just the German army, but also the Russian winter, which seems determined to destroy us all." Despite these challenges, the Soviet forces continued to push forward, driven by a fierce determination to defend their homeland and defeat the Nazi invaders. On August 12, 1942, they launched another major attack on the German positions around Rzhev, this time using a combination of infantry, tanks, and air power. The Soviet troops made some initial gains, breaking through the German lines in several places and pushing deep into the enemy's rear. However, the Germans quickly regrouped and counterattacked, using their superior mobility and firepower to devastating effect. The Soviet troops were thrown back, suffering heavy casualties and losing much of the ground they had gained. The battle raged on, with both sides trading blows and neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The outcome hung in the balance as the two armies clashed in a frenzy of steel and fire that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. As the battle raged on, the Soviet forces continued to suffer heavy casualties, but they refused to give up. On August 23, 1942, they launched another major attack on the German positions around Rzhev, this time using a massive artillery barrage to soften up the enemy's defenses. The Soviet troops made significant gains, breaking through the German lines and pushing deep into the enemy's rear. The sound of cannons thundered across the landscape, shaking the earth beneath their feet as they advanced. The smell of smoke and sweat hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the brutality of war. The Germans, however, were not ready to surrender yet. They counterattacked with ferocity, using their superior mobility and firepower to devastating effect. The Soviet troops were thrown back, suffering heavy casualties and losing much of the ground they had gained. The battle seesawed back and forth, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. This cat-and-mouse game played out over weeks, each side probing for weaknesses in the other's defenses, searching for that one decisive blow that would shatter the enemy's will. As the months dragged on, the Soviet forces began to adapt, learning from their mistakes and evolving their tactics. They developed new strategies, incorporating combined arms warfare and flexible command structures that allowed them to respond quickly to changing circumstances on the battlefield. The Germans, too, were forced to adapt, but their own rigid doctrine and over-reliance on traditional methods hindered their ability to innovate. It wasn't until March 1943 that the Soviet forces finally broke through the German lines and liberated Rzhev. The city was in ruins, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its streets littered with the bodies of the dead and wounded. The Soviet troops had suffered over 1 million casualties during the battle, while the Germans had lost around 300,000 men. As the survivors walked through the devastated city, they were met with scenes of unimaginable horror, families torn apart, homes destroyed, and the stench of death hanging heavy in the air. The Battle of Rzhev was one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, and it marked a significant turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. As one historian noted, the Battle of Rzhev was a Pyrrhic victory for the Soviet Union, but it was a crucial one. It showed that the Red Army could withstand even the most brutal attacks and emerge victorious in the end. This testament to Soviet resilience and determination would have far-reaching consequences, as it marked a shift in the balance of power on the Eastern Front. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.